What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and if you're enjoying the content here on my channel, then make sure you hit the like button and make sure you hit subscribe so you can help decide what direction the content on my channel goes in the foreseeable future. So in truth, I absolutely love the character of Rorschach. In my mind, he's probably like the standout star of Watchmen. And I feel like I'm not the only one who feels that way. I feel like a lot of people really look at the character of Rorschach and absolutely love him. I'm not gonna get into a whole debate of Rorschach versus Batman. I'm actually gonna leave that to you guys. Who do you think would win in a fight, Rorschach or Batman? Like an impromptu fight, no prep time. Who do you think would come out on top? I imagine the arguments are gonna be kind of insane, but I'm just kind of curious. Honestly, the one thing I'm looking forward to the most is like a Rorschach Batman team up. That would be amazing. That would be so cool to see Rorschach and Batman in the same comic together. I would go absolutely nuts. But Rorschach is dark. I mean, it's crazy. And his comic reflects that. Of course, before the Watchmen gives us the events of these characters before Watchmen happens. Now, in truth, with Rorschach, we don't really get like a tried and true origin per se, simply because of the fact that we got that in Watchmen number 6. I mean, we learned that he was basically the son of a woman who was a prostitute. He doesn't know his father's name. His mother was constantly abusive towards him. And it wasn't until he got in a fight with some bullies that he was actually removed from the house because the living conditions were so bad. But Rorschach's role within the realm of the Watchmen was really just kind of picking up where he believed the police had failed, in the sense that there were some criminals out there who didn't deserve prison. There were some criminals out there who didn't deserve the ability to repent for their crimes, just because of the fact that their crimes were so heinous. And that's one of the crazy things about this, is because Rorschach in a lot of ways is a more extreme version of Batman. We know that Batman's general rule, despite how he acts, despite how he conducts himself, is this whole notion of everyone deserves the ability to be rehabilitated. That's why he doesn't kill the Joker. His argument is that if he can keep the Joker in Arkham Asylum, given enough time, the Joker can be rehabilitated, or at the very least, the Joker's so far gone that he simply just needs to be kept away from everybody else. But with Rorschach, it's a lot more visceral. It's a lot more real, because in his mind, the scum of existence are people who continue to repeat crimes. They commit a crime, they're thrown in jail, they're let out, and they commit crimes again. In the eyes of Rorschach, there are no second chances. If you commit a crime, that's it. Now, of course, there are certain things that he just doesn't really care about. I mean, in truth, like a purse snatcher isn't really something he'd pay special attention to. In this story, he's actually kind of interested, or at least he's pursuing a guy called the Bard, but really more so than that, or at least there's a crime going on with a guy called the Bard. More so than that, what he's looking for is really like a major hustler, a guy who's really peddling drugs within the city. And again, one of the ways that this starts with is just some random guy, really a guy named by the name of Dwayne Carter, who's just like a street hustler. I mean, that's really it. But this shows us the brutal nature of Rorschach, right? I mean, to get information out of this guy, he just starts beating the crap out of him. He breaks some fingers. He basically threatens to break his arm. I mean, he does all kinds of things to basically turn this guy's life upside down. The other half of this is that Rorschach has developed a reputation as dark, as sadistic, as twisted as it is. This reputation that he's not a man to be messed with, that he's not a man to be trifled with. Now again, Rorschach's really just kind of going for this whole taking down these various drug peddlers, taking down these larger criminals, different things like that. Now, of course, this is one of those scenarios where it's really more of deal with the cause of the problem instead of the symptom. You treat the colds, you don't treat the symptoms. And so because of that, ignoring prostitutes, ignoring all that kind of different stuff, he focuses on what he considers to be the big fish, a guy by the name of Rawhead. And that's kind of what's ironic here, is because there's a series of murders taking place with a guy named the Bard, and Rorschach doesn't deal with any of that. He's got bigger fish to fry. He's got major things to focus on. Now, what this is designed to do is show us that Rorschach picks and chooses what it is that he goes after, but more so than that, there are things, again, that simply just are not worth his time, or that he intends to kind of follow up with later on. So it's really sort of interesting. When it comes to the Bard, of course, what we end up finding out is that he had basically just gone through and just, killed various women. It seemed like women of the night, or at least women that he just explicitly targeted, and then carves their bodies and then just kind of leaves them in a dumpster somewhere. But the fact remains that after Rorschach comes into contact with Rawhead, and Rawhead's guys, beat the crap out of Rorschach, the initial idea is to take off the mask and see who's underneath. But for Rawhead, what he says is that in his mind, Rorschach was like this bigger than life kind of guy, right? Where he had amassed this massive reputation. Criminals around the city went fleeing and shaking in their boots when Rorschach comes calling. But in the mind of Rawhead, he looks at him and says, like, you're a lot smaller than I thought you would be. You really can't be that tough if you've been taken out this easily. And so with Rorschach more or less down and effectively just kind of left for dead, Rawhead and his guys sort of take to the city. Now, that's what's kind of interesting about this, is that in a lot of ways, Rorschach is very street level. He's very on the ground floor. He's not taking out, these major international drug criminals or anything like that. It's the smaller guys. It's the local guys who think that they're big fish, who think that they're a big deal. Now, again, the reputation animation is more than just Rorschach fighting out bad guys, it's making bad guys afraid of him. It's very much what Batman does in terms of his whole fear aspect. You know, you read any Batman comic, somewhere along the line, he's basically going to say that fear is just as much of a weapon for him as the various gadgets in his mind. And so with Rorschach, it's much the same way. But the other half of this, Rorschach makes his escape. At this point, he actually ends up kind of stumbling into a diner with a particular woman. Now, we don't know her name right off the bat. All we know is that Rorschach has been coming there routinely and been getting breakfast there almost every single time. But at the same time, there's discussions on how the world is. Now, again, from Rorschach's perspective, everything is really dark. The world is really twisted. We know this is really just a byproduct of his upbringing, the bad experiences that he's had. The explanation he offers in terms of why he looks that way is because he was quote unquote mugged. You know, it's really just kind of offering these half explanations, these half truths. Now, the reason why Rorschach does this is, remember, no one really knows what Rorschach looks like without the mask. The secret identity he has is one of his most useful weapons because he can literally hide in plain sight. He can just kind of stand around and watch things unfold and no one's any of the wiser. He could walk right by Rawhead and Rawhead would have no idea who it was that he was walking past. He'd have no idea that it was Rorschach. Now, of course, this also leads to Rorschach going through and pursuing a handful of these criminals and things like that, some various members of Rawhead's team in open daylight. And this is kind of a big deal because it shows us the lengths that Rorschach will go to. Whether it's light, whether it's dark, somebody's not making it out of the situation. Somebody here is almost done with all their living. And Rorschach will ensure that happens. And that's kind of what's cool about this, is because he will go to the ends of the earth to make sure that justice is done. Now, of course, with one of these guys injured by a vehicle that he's driving, the whole identity, the ability for people to not know what he looks like comes into play. Now, this is a bit of irony that's being given here, you know, in the sense that DC is really just kind of sitting down, at least this was written by DC at the time, but it's really just kind of sitting down and saying, hey, look, you know, had they known what he looked like, things would have been a whole lot easier. And in fact, we'll see that here in a little while. But Rorschach actually torches one of the guys, basically throws a Molotov cocktail and burns him alive. Now, of course, with the one survivor basically going to Rawhead with a message in the form of a piece of paper with a Rorschach ink blot test on it, the message here is that Rorschach is still very much alive and Rorschach is going to be coming for all of them. Now, of course, passing out in the local diner, you know, after arriving, you know, speaking with this woman for a little bit and then waking up in a hospital, this is kind of cool because, again, it shows us how durable and how resilient Rorschach is and the various people that he goes against and the various people that he faces off with. Of course, we also end up picking up with a woman who's basically dealing with her pimp, more or less, and the guy's beating the absolute hell out of her, but the reason why is because he works for Rawhead, and in his mind, you know, he has to pay Rawhead. You know, he's making the argument that she's really not bringing in enough money or whatever the case may be. But with Rorschach taking this guy out, the woman's allowed to go back to her life. Now, this is really kind of interesting. This is a little bit ironic because what this does is it paints this picture that this woman has an opportunity to basically walk away from the life that she's been in, but she goes right back to that life. Now, the reason why she pursues it is something that's just not given to us, and we could speculate on her backstory and really make up anything we wanted to, but we're not going to. All we're simply going to say is this is an indication in this story where people choose in a lot of ways the paths that they're on. And that's really the basis behind Rorschach, right? He could walk away from this life anytime he wanted to. He could just walk away. He could just stop everything that he's doing, but it's almost like a compulsion. It's almost like something he has to do. It's almost like he can't walk away from this life because this is the only thing he has. This is the purpose that he serves. If this life isn't here, then what else does he have? Now, in terms of the ruthlessness of Rorschach, this is probably one of the most ruthless things I've ever seen him do. He puts a piece of glass in the guy's mouth and then punches it, shattering the glass and destroying the side of the guy's cheek. That is cold-blooded. I mean, that is ruthless, about as ruthless as it can get. Now, of course, this guy doesn't necessarily dump all the information that Rorschach's looking for, which of course leads him, you know, back into the fray and facing off against a handful of these other goons who have come to this guy's rescue. But of course, again, jumping out the window, making his escape, we end up having him talk to just a random guy. Now, the funny thing about this conversation that he has with this random cab driver is that it's just as much about perception as it is about reality, right? I mean, Rorschach says the city that he lives in, you know, New York, all that kind of stuff, that it's all just, it's garbage, it's trash. The city is effectively dying because the people in it are amoral. The people in it have no real moral compass. They just satisfy their own base desires and that's it. Whether it's businessmen, hookers, drug users, and so on down at the bottom, and everybody in between, people just live on their own base animalistic instincts. And in his mind, the city's basically falling apart at the seams and it's inherently dying. What this conversation with the cab driver shows us is that it's not necessarily that way. It's Rorschach's perception, but how he views the world, how he views the city is not necessarily how the city is. And it's one of those crazy things. You go to the wrong part of town at the wrong time of day and you're not from that town, that's going to be your perception of that town. But if you go to the right side of town on the right time of day, that's going to be your perception of the town. It's all a matter of how you view things. It's all all a matter of where you keep yourself, how you allow your view to be shaped by the things that you see and the things that you do. So again, it's really kind of cool that basically Rorschach's living a self-fulfilling prophecy. He believes the city's falling apart. He knows this because he spends all of his time in the parts of the city that are falling apart. So he's just confirming his own bias. He's simply saying, I have a belief system, and now I'm going to look for facts to verify that belief system instead of taking the more intelligent route and basically saying, here are all the facts. What do these facts conclude? So again, it's really kind of a funny situation, but the fact remains here, the Bard is still committing these crimes. The Bard is still killing these women. The Bard is still leaving their bodies for the police to find. Now, at this point, we actually end up joining back with the server back at the diner. Now, the interesting situation with regards to Rorschach talking with Nancy, the waitress of the diner, is that it's almost like this little bit of happiness, this little bit of what could be a reasonable situation in his life, find a nice girl. And I wouldn't really say settle down. I have a hard time believing that like Rorschach and Nancy would buy like a house in the countryside, pop out a couple kids, settle down and kind of live their life in, in a mundane fashion. I have a hard time believing that would happen. Like it wouldn't really work out that way for his character. And on the surface, we know that, right? I mean, we know that with these two, it would never really work out that way. But the great thing about this story and the great thing about Rorschach's character is we hope it does. Like, we hope he finds some measure of happiness. We hope he finds a small measure of peace, that he goes somewhere and is able to just kind of soothe his soul and chill out and just enjoy life for what it is. But it won't be that way just because we know that this takes place before Watchmen and we know about the events during Watchmen. Now, of course, with the survival of Rawhead, the first and foremost thing to focus on is the death of Rorschach. I mean, it's literally to kill this guy just because of the fact that at this point, it's really just more of an insult than anything else. It's really just kind of a pride thing. Now, of course, Rawhead uses the scenario of a couple women of the night to basically try to lure Rorschach out, which of course he doesn't really buy into, but he does kind of follow him around. Now, again, this secret identity that Rorschach has as a person is what allows him to walk around in the general public. And this is the instance we were talking about of how Rorschach could walk right behind or right next to Rawhead and he would never know that it was Rorschach. He would have no idea. And so what he ends up doing is basically breaking into Rawhead's place and then just more or less allowing everything to run amok. I mean, literally just ripping through his guys, kind of tearing him up and calling it a day. Now, the funny thing is that when it gets to the point whereby he ends up with Rawhead himself, that, Rorschach's kind of forced to fight against one of Rorschach's more, capable guys. But the entire time, Rawhead's just kind of dancing around, acting crazy, doing all these little dance maneuvers and so on and so forth, and celebrating the moment. Now, of course, this means that, when the mask of Rorschach is pulled off, everybody knows his identity, but the insanity of Rawhide begins to show itself when he throws on the mask of Rorschach and then begins to kind of dance around as Rorschach himself. So again, it's pretty crazy, it's pretty wild. But then we switch back to Nancy. And the reason why this matters is because of the fact that in this citywide blackout, the words of Rorschach begin to ring back, when he basically tells her, hey, look, the city's dying, the city's a cesspool. If they're given the opportunity, if people are given a choice between following their animal nature and being intelligent, they'll choose their animal nature. And the way this is depicted is by looting, is by rioting. Nancy's simply looking around at everything that's going on and saying, when the city's at its weakest, all these people are doing is just tearing things up. They're just ripping things to pieces. They're just stealing things. Why? Because they can. And so because of this, we actually end up finding out that the Bard has essentially targeted Nancy. That stumbling across the two of them, the Bard is also someone that Nancy recognizes. And that's kind of the craziness of it. Now, with regards to Rorschach having been taken by Rawhead and Rawhead really just kind of losing his mind and going on about nonsense, and one of his guys being left to basically torture and kill Rorschach. In the middle of all this, Rawhead actually goes out into the streets of New York to act like Rorschach. Now, this is kind of funny because this is a scenario where Rawhead is really just kind of getting carried away, where he's really just kind of going absolutely bonkers. But the other half of this is how he sees himself. And that's what's really kind of ironic here. Rawhead, being a guy who has, basically scars and so on and so forth all around his head, basically makes the case that when people see him, they see him for his physical appearance. He can put the mask on and he's anybody else. He can be anyone under that mask. And that's kind of an on-running thing when it comes to Rorschach, because again, when no one knows what he looks like, he could be anybody. And so again, it's really just kind of a face in the crowd. And it's one of the things that Rorschach always relied on without his mask. But the fact remains that Rorschach basically is able to break free when the tiger that he had previously used to attack the henchmen of Rawhead basically breaks into the room with the guy that's torturing Rorschach and of course kills him, and then Rorschach makes his escape, and that's really the end of that. that. But the funny thing is that with regards to Rawhead, because he gets so carried away and he takes on a bunch of these thugs, one of them breaks his neck by hitting him in the back of the head with a baseball bat. And so he comes to an end quick, fast, and in a hurry. But having his work effectively done for him, Rorschach puts his mask on and basically calls it a night. And so what ends up happening here is we basically follow up with him when he's tracking down the Bard. And what had happened was Nancy had survived the experience. Nancy had managed to get away and then just bailed out on the city. She literally just took off. And so we never get a resolution to that. We never find out what's going on. Not only that, with the Bard himself, we end up having Rorschach basically find out where the guy's located at, who was a regular at the diner, and kill him. And that's really it. We don't get a whole lot of exposition. We don't really get a whole lot of explanation. The reason why it's designed to be that way is because the Watchmen in and of themselves were written to be more visceral. They were written to be real, tangible, something you could look out your window and legitimately see. Now, I wouldn't say that you would see a guy walking around with a mask. That's literally a constantly rotating Rorschach ink blot test, but I will say it's not outside the realm of possibility for a guy to put a mask on, a trench coat, and a top hat, and then walk around and just start attacking people who are committing crimes. You see it all the time. Vigilantism is not an uncommon theme. And so because of that, it makes sense that this story would conclude without any major resolution. It would just be, and the Bard's found, and then he's dead, and that's it. It makes sense that that would be the case because that's how you would expect it to play out in the Watchmen. That's how you would expect it to play out in the real world. The Bard may have even gotten away with his crimes. We don't really even see what he physically looks like. All we know is that he's just a white guy. He's got dark hair. We don't see the details of his own individual face. So again, this is just kind of Brian Azzarello's way of bringing us a really interesting character, a really interesting development for Rorschach before the Watchmen started. I definitely loved this information that we got here. But if you guys are new here to Comics Explained, make sure you guys hit the sub button to become part of the Rob Core. If you guys enjoy this video, make sure you drop a like, and I will catch you all later. Peace.